Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's midday discussion, Trade and Technology, Partners or Rivals, Unlocking the Potential of Transatlantic Cooperation. So welcome you all, also online viewers. The house is full, so I guess it's a good sign also for the importance of the topic. 10 years ago, discussion about transatlantic relations here in Brussels was very, very different. We were speaking about TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and high hopes, high optimism, and a lot of ambition. Unfortunately, things went as they went, and the whole deal went through. Then there was a discussion and thinking, what shall we do now? How we secure that the issues which we need to discuss between US and EU are discussed. And so then the whole concept of the Trade and Technology Council was created. And especially looking now, what is the transatlantic discussion, it's very clear that this council, which has very maybe administrative sound, holds the key of many important issues for the years to come. And as we discussed just before in a cafe, before coming here, it's very unlikely that something more, institutionally something more will be created before elections. Transatlantic relations as the whole, actually international dynamics are living in quite volatile times. We know all what the discussion are. And especially for us, think tanks, for Martens Center, it is a great pleasure actually. I think it is the first time we have cooperation with SEPA. We much appreciate that because I think that in the future, this year and next year, depending of course also how the US elections will come, I think a lot of fine-tuning and connection and discussion is needed. And this is a starting point for that. So I would like to thank you all coming, and I would like to welcome Ronan Murphy, Director of the Digital Innovation Initiative from SEPA, who is one of the key authors of the paper we are going to discuss and present, and the topic, I would like to welcome him. So welcome.
Just to avoid confusion, I'll change the nameplates. Thank you very much, Tommy, and I'd like to thank the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies for partnering with SEPA. This has been the first time we've done something like this, and it's gone really well. We've been really happy with the cooperation we've managed to achieve. And I think in a way it reflects what SEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, is all about. We are about promoting the Transatlantic Alliance. We're positive on the Transatlantic Alliance. We're Washington, D.C. based. I am not American, as you may have guessed, so I'm an Irishman, so in a way I represent that transatlantic bridge. I live in DC, work for an American think tank, and now I've come back to promote the American think tank in Brussels. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. I'd like to congratulate the authors, Bill and Dimitar, who you're going to hear from shortly, on the report. Again, it's very much in keeping with what SEPA is all about, promoting that positive engagement, looking for convergence where it's sensible, and we try and produce output that is accessible and pithy, if you want to call it that. And it the word is accessible, it is digestible, and we always land on some recommendations or things along those lines to try and move the conversation forward. Also like to thank Elena and Nicole for joining us on the panel today. Thank you very much for that. It's great to have an opportunity here to have some discussion. And I'm going to hand over rather promptly to our moderator for this discussion, Dan Michaels from the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronan, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here. Originally, it was going to be my colleague Kim McCrail, but she got pulled up to Antwerp to this big industrial deal meeting that's happening today, and I think we might touch on in our discussion because industrialization, deindustrialization, obviously is a big transatlantic issue, but it's an honor, pleasure for me I'm a bit transatlantic myself, as you can probably tell. Ronan, you and I are sort of opposite sides of a coin. I'm the American in Brussels for an American global newspaper. And our Brussels bureau, which I oversee, really overwhelmingly focuses on transatlantic issues. We spend a lot of time explaining what goes on here to readers, mostly in the US, but elsewhere. So the Bill and Dimitar are going to introduce the report, which I'm sure you've all had a chance to look at, but is I have to say, as someone who followed the TTC since it was just the germ of an idea, and I attended the second one outside Paris, I've followed all of them, I found this a really useful summary because even sort of a TTC groupie like me finds it hard to keep track, and in a very not transatlantic way, I will use a baseball metaphor that you can't tell the game without a scorecard, and this is a great scorecard. I will hand over by saying that it poses the question in the title, Transatlantic Trade and Technology, Rivals or Partners, and the answer is clearly yes. Bill, Dimitar, over to you to introduce your report.
Thanks. You can join us on the panel. Thanks, Dan. I think you're right. That's what we tried to do, which was to do a scorecard in a sense in the baseball, and hopefully we're at the 5th inning and not the 9th, which would have left us at the end of the story. So we wanted to intervene at this time to try to get us to continue the process. And I think it was important when we started this project, we saw that we started looking into free trade, ambitious TTIP, ambitious free trade deals, and why they had failed. Do I need to use that? Thank you. Thanks. Is it working now? It doesn't seem to be. Now it is? Okay, there it is. Thank you. So as I was saying, we're at the 5th inning, and we wanted to intervene and try to hit a home run to get the thing back on track so that let's say the transatlantic team would win in the 9th inning if we continue the baseball narrative. I'm American too, but I've lived in Europe even as longer than you, Dan. I think since the 1990s I've been in Brussels, so I'm based here, but working for an American think tank, and I think that gave us a good perspective. We did a lot of research in both Washington and Europe, and interviews, desk research, and so forth. What we found was at the beginning there was an important realization that there was no appetite for a free trade deal, so we needed to come up with an alternative mechanism, and that was TTIP. This was a European idea. It was very clear, and I think that's one of the problems we're facing right now. It was first proposed by the European Commission while Donald Trump was still in office. Donald Trump ignored it, and it was retaken afterwards up by the Biden administration, reproposed and re-engaged. That's the history of it. I think that's led to some of the issues that we found, which was the Europeans in general were very enthusiastic, and the Americans were a little bit more ho-hum. I think some Americans, especially the ones who were involved in TTIP, thought that it was not ambitious enough, this Trade and Technology Council. And so we did have, I think, a debate that we describe in the paper between maximalists and minimalists. And I think the right place, the maximalists were sort of disappointed. The minimalists were sort of pleasantly surprised by the TTIP's achievements. So I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, as we say. It got off to a good start. We recount the history. The TTIP did, the Trade and Technology Council was inaugurated in Pittsburgh, then in Paris, and everyone agreed on export sanctions to Russia. It wasn't done only within the Trade and Technology Council, but it was something that they could focus on and achieve a big win. And since then, it's sort of, unfortunately, muddled along, is what we found, till we get to the last conference or summit, which was held in Washington with no communique, no clear message, And it became clear to us that our message had to be reform. What could we do to improve this system? What were the problems and what were the potential solutions? And we saw that there were both issues on the focus, the issues being handled, and also on the administrative or the structure of the council. And so we came up with a bunch of suggestions that are outlined here. 10 working groups. Everyone felt that that was too many that we interviewed, that we got lost in the details and forgot about the big overarching picture. So maybe continue the working council, working parties, but reduce their importance. And it was important also, we feel, that there be a clear leadership. When you had these summits, that you had Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Commerce Raimondo, it was sort of, no one was clear who was taking charge. And we would believe that president to president would be an improvement on this system. And then we felt also that there needed to be more stakeholder engagement. We looked at the AI summit that the UK put on and saw and considered it really a success because it managed to mobilize the global conversation in a way that the Trade and Technology Council just hasn't. So we would engage or suggest that there should be additional CEOs invited and so forth. And we also feel that this is perhaps the best venue for Congress to Congress, parliamentarian to parliamentarian dialogue, which isn't taking place right now, frankly. Parliament is a key actor in digital regulation, and it hasn't really been engaged with the US Congress. And this would be a good way to enlarge the impact of the Trade and Technology Council. Finally, we thought that 2 summits a year, too many. People would complain to us that they'd finish one summit and then they'd have 2 days off and they'd have to start working on the communique for the next summit. And that was not the most effective way. So reduce it to 1 summit a year, 1 summit every 18 months, but make it a bigger event, a more focused event. The second thing we thought was that each summit should have a focus. Right now we're into details about whether connectivity plans to Kenya or Jamaica, which was one of the outputs of one of the summits. And instead we should focus on the big issues, getting a green tech transatlantic alliance, secure critical minerals, but each summit should have a clear and overriding theme that would mobilize the attention and the focus of the stakeholders. We're facing a tough time looking forward, elections on both sides of the Atlantic. That was one of the motivations for doing this paper, was to try to get these issues out before, or out on the table before new politicians could come in and just junk the Trade and Technology Council. We hear everything is on hold until the new administrations come, but I think if some of these reforms were taken beforehand, it would have a better chance of persisting and remaining a valuable sort of conduit for transatlantic relations in what surely is going to be a turbulent times. So I'll hand it over to you, Dimitar. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll try with the mic sitting down. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Pleasure to be here, of course. I don't want to reiterate what's already been said, but I think this is the first report coming out from a European and American think tank institution dealing with these issues, and I think it was very important for us to step down from our individual ivory towers in Brussels and DC talking about these questions and try to address it in a joint manner. Bill already touched upon the fact that we don't have a trade and investment agreement, and honestly, it's a bit bizarre, isn't it? We are dealing with a third of global trade. Transatlantic trade in terms of goods and services is ballpark $1.5 trillion every year. We're talking about massive investment flows as well, FDIs. We don't have an investment agreement. And the only thing we actually have in terms of administrations talking to each other on a supranational federal level is a Trade and Technology Council, and it's not even doing as much as intended. So our main impetus for the report was to make sure that we strengthen these ties, not on a bilateral basis, because the states love talking with European member states individually, the individual capitals, but how can we make sure that DC talks with Brussels and the European institutions so that we can push forward as economic blocs and make sure that this has a positive spillover on our joint interests and our joint values when it comes to international trade and digital technology. Now, I just want to touch upon two major chunks here. One on the context and the background and the European expectations behind the TTC, and maybe the future on the policy side. Bill gave a really good summary on what should we do in terms of restructuring. I'll also talk about policies a bit. So what actually happened in 21 when the whole thing was set up? We had moved on from the Trump administration. There was this, love was in the air in Brussels. Biden came along, and there were so many expectations. Look at the joint statement in 21 between the US and Brussels. We set up this new expectation that we're going to make sure that we uphold global democracy. We're going to fight COVID internationally. We're going to make sure that global growth is back. And if you look at that document from 21, the ambitions were very high. And Brussels really expected that we're going to work with the Americans when it comes to democracy, engagement internationally, climate change mitigation internationally, and also make sure that we're ahead when it comes to critical technologies. What did the American administration want in the last couple of years? Well, it turns out that, and in the interviews we had and speaking with different experts, Washington actually expected that the Trade and Technology Council would be a vehicle for China containment. It will be a vehicle which would actually make sure that it serves the American initial and major goal right now to make sure that we curb China's economic reach and also digital reach internationally. So there was an inherent clash of expectations in the last couple of years. And let me very briefly just say, even though the expectation was very high from the Brussels crowd, because I live in Brussels and I talk about the European expectations here, what actually transpired in the last couple of years when it comes to transatlantic relations on trade and tech? First, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. It really ruffled lots of feathers in Brussels. The French were completely against it. Even Thierry Breton, the commissioner, boycotted the TTC summit, and he decided not to participate because of the IRA. I'm not a fan of this approach, very French approach, but it showed that there's a certain amount of grievances in Brussels when it comes to the whole attitude of the US when it comes to subsidizing their industries and their green tech and their clean tech, and not allowing European critical components or European electric vehicles to be able to participate for tax breaks or subsidies under the IRA, which was not a really good sign. This could have been discussed in advance. Secondly, in October 22, we had the major bombshell of the Defense Department, the Commerce Department in the US, launching the unilateral export controls on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing. So this was done by the administration with the major aim to curb China's access to critical hardware and also make sure that software, European components, American components and software is not used by the Chinese for dual-use items or to advance their civil-military fusion strategies. Fine. But this was, again, imposed unilaterally. It was not discussed with European partners within the TTC format. And it was also extraterritorial, meaning that the Americans basically said to the world and their allies, we're going to write down these rules, and you guys are going to follow them as well. So Washington managed to, in a way, bully the Japanese and also the Dutch in making sure that they also apply these export controls, which meant that in Europe, we have this crown jewels of a company, ASML, producing advanced lithography components and really breakthrough stuff when it comes to literally printing on wafers with light, real advanced technology. The Americans basically said, you're not going to export to China. Fine, I personally sympathize with the goal of curbing China's access to advanced technology, but this means that a European company is going to lose profit because the American government forces it to do so. Is this the best way to address these issues with your transatlantic partners? I'm not really sure. Finally, we still also have the aluminum and steel tariffs applying to European companies as well. This was launched by the Trump administration. The World Trade Organization said it's illegal, but our American partners just shrugged it off, and we continue to have to face pressures on aluminum and steel. Not to mention also the recurring problems we've had for over a decade when it comes to big tech companies, the whole data issue, the fact that the National Security Agency is wiretapping maybe European data, and all of that. So this is the whole context, meaning that we had this big promise and aspiring hope to be better at trade and tech, but actually the Biden administration hasn't been such a great friend of Europe so far. So the Trade and Technology Council is not going to solve all of these problems. We're not going to address all of these issues, but it becomes a really important venue to talk about these formats, economic bloc to economic bloc, Washington to Brussels, not individual capitals. And we think that there is a way to reinforce it. Bill was very eloquent on making sure that we streamline it and adapt it. And in the report, we suggest a couple of big wins in the future. First of all, we need a EU-US agreement on critical materials, so that we can be more secure when it comes to our European interests, when it comes to access to critical materials and supply chains, because we saw that these supply chains can be pressurized. And also, European critical materials and electric vehicles should have access to IRA subsidies and tax breaks, so that European companies can also be part of this whole initiative. Very importantly, and this I think is something which maybe is going to come out as one of the biggest wins of the initiative. We need to have a green tech marketplace or a clean initiative on free trade on clean technologies, whatever you want to name it. I think green tech area is one of the names under consideration. We need to be able, between the US and the EU, to exchange batteries, EVs, clean technologies without tariffs, without hindrances to trade, so we can leverage our markets and make sure that not only we spend more than €1 trillion in goods and trade, but in the future, our joint economic blocs can actually handle the challenges coming internationally and also from Asia. We need to have standards, joint standards on electric vehicles, batteries, charging stations. This sounds a bit boring and a bit technical, but to be honest, think about the huge implications of standards on EVs or charging stations in the future. So this is something which both administrations have made progress so far, but I hope that we can also manage to keep this up, because look what China has been doing internationally. Through standard-setting organizations, through the UN, through the International Telecommunications Union, and many other bodies, the Chinese are pushing their own visions of the internet and also future of the whole sector, mobilizing also the global south, and we need to be able to respond to this. And finally, and I'm going to close here, this is my own, a bit of a think tank spin-off on the whole topic, but when it comes to climate change and carbon emissions globally, I think the Americans are starting to warm up to Europe's CBAM and the whole idea that we need to have some kind of a price on carbon. Politically, this in the US right now is very difficult. We're not going to see progress this year for sure. But what the administrations have already started doing is talking about specific methodologies on pricing carbon, or factoring in that when you're producing steel from a coal power plant in China, this is very dirty steel. And there is a difference between European steel and Chinese steel, meaning that we need to work on a transatlantic approach to carbon management, carbon methodologies, so that in the long run, we have something like a transatlantic CBAM or a mechanism which can actually make sure that by the end of this decade, we see progress on climate mitigation. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dimitar. Thank you, Bill. That was a great summary and a lot of material for us to follow up on. And just to pick up on one point that I think we can return to, but in your initial comments that it's kind of surprising that there's no transatlantic agreement on almost any of this. One of the problems I think everybody knows with the IRA is Senator Joe Manchin thought we had one of these and thought that EU would be included in the IRA. So it's sort of the original sin of the IRA, and if one can put it in those terms. I'm now going to hand off to our other panelists to offer perspective. I think maybe I will start with Elina, since you are the official representing the Commission here. You are a member of the cabinet of Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, who handles trade, among many other issues, but is really at the forefront of a lot of this. So, Alina, maybe your thoughts on some of the substance of the report, what you've heard today, and more broadly on TTC and where it goes from here.
Thanks a lot, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining to this event. And thanks for your very, very thorough kind of reporting on what has been done and hasn't been done. My first reaction to your comment on whether the Biden administration has been a friend to Europe, I would say yes, they have been a good friend to Europe. And I don't think that the next administration, whether it's Trump, would be a better friend to Europe than the current one. So, but maybe I'll start by kind of giving my own reflection on what has been said in the report from my perspective, because I'm steering this work alongside my colleague in cabinet of Executive Vice President Vestager. And I'm steering this work for the EVP Dombrovskis, mainly on trade side of the TTC. So I wanted to reflect on what has been said so far and also what has been said in the report. And first, I wanted to say that TTC, it's a new format for the transatlantic engagement, and therefore we have explored different ways to make sure that it works. It's a broad platform that it is constantly evolving compared to other platforms, similar ones, which you mentioned in your report, which we had in the past. We have 10 working groups, and people get to know each other, people talk to each other, people engage. So it means that the TTC is already half of a institutionalized, and we have a very good working structure in place. For example, I can give you an example. In the first meetings of the TTC, we had working group chairs reporting to the principals and making progress, and then we dropped this because we thought, no, it doesn't work. It's just we need to have, because it took up a lot of time. So instead, we strengthened an internal coordination of the working groups in the Commission. And to sum up this point, we are learning by doing. And so the TTC structure can be further developed and adjusted as needed, which goes to your point on the working groups and whether we think they have delivered well. And if you need to readjust them, we can do it. There's no issue about that. So my second point is that despite differences, we have succeeded in developing the TTC as the main platform for cooperation with the US. And the TTC was given a high profile at the first EU-US summit in this political mandate, which helped to ensure that there is a strong commitment on both sides at the political and technical level to drive the agenda forward. So as your report indicates, there have been ups and downs with several non-TTC events that had an impact on the TTC itself. AUKUS was one of them, the IRA, obviously. But for the continuity of this platform, the key will be the political will of both sides. I'm sure that the next Commission will do everything it can for the TTC to continue. Know how much we have achieved under this platform. We have heard mixed views. In my view, the major achievement is that this allows us to build a new relationship with the US, where we can discuss any trade and technology issues between us. We have used the TTC to work through our differences on issues like the Inflation Reduction Act, where we have succeeded in removing barriers to our car companies when accessing the IRA tax credits. The TTC was also instrumental for getting our sanctions teams to align our approach to export controls against Russia. On the trade side, we have updated the scope of the EU-US mutual recognition agreement for pharmaceutical goods to include veterinary medicine, and we have reached an alignment on how we do standards for charging electric heavy-duty vehicles. The work is ongoing in this area, and some more outcomes are to be expected by the next TTC meeting. So for the last TTC meeting in this political cycle, which we hope to hold here in Belgium in April, we should focus on delivering really meaningful outcomes, including on trade. We want to make real progress in two areas, sustainable trade and economic security. On sustainable trade, we are aiming to cooperate on conformity assessment, for which green goods and technologies there is room to ease the conformity assessment procedures. And this would help us to reduce trade costs between the EU and US. The results very much will depend on how much openness there will be on the US side to take this work stream forward. We also want to improve the use of digital tools that facilitate trade. One of the very concrete areas here is e-invoicing, and to make sure that we kind of align our system of invoicing to make sure that traders have less bureaucratic barriers there. And we are very much looking forward the input from the Transatlantic stakeholder event, which was held in Washington around the TTC, on creating green marketplace, where we want to pick up some of the ideas from this event and then to be further elaborated in the TTC. When it comes to economic security, as you have noticed, the Commission came out with its own proposal just months ago. This is an area where we want to further expand our cooperation with the Americans, whether it's on investment screening, export controls, or on the resilience of supply chains, especially when we see in view of the green transition. So we are fleshing out ideas for the next TTC, and one of the ideas to launch a cooperation on the solar supply chains, for example. On export controls, we continue to work to ensure that enforcement of sanctions against Russia is in place, so including vis-à-vis third countries. Then, maybe last but not least, a couple of words about the future of the TTC. I think we have laid a solid foundation. It's been useful across the board. It's a trusted platform. And for the last TTC meeting, we want to present the vision of the TTC. We need to present the vision, what comes after. And we need to communicate clearly what is the added value of this platform. And I think regardless of the outcome of the US elections, we have a substantial balance sheet for the next administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Elina. It was great to get the perspective from inside the Berlaymont on what's been happening, and I think interesting to get your sort of preview of April, because I tend to agree from what I've heard people talking about the TTC that there was expectation at the beginning, then hopefully a lot of work has been done behind the scenes that's not visible, but and because it's not visible, there's some disappointment, and if there are concrete deliverables in April, all will be forgiven, and the future of the TTC probably will be more certain, but I think, and I'm going to hand off to you, Mikhail, in a second to get the perspective from business on this. But if the deliverables in April are seen to fall flat, then I think there will be a lot of disappointment, probably to whoever is in the White House come January will be questioning what the future of the TTC is. So, Mikkel, you are a senior policy advisor at AmCham EU, the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU. The voice of American business and including some European business here in Brussels. So, among other things, if you could give us the business perspective on the TTC, the expectations, the feeling as it's evolved, and what is the hope for where it goes?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot first and foremost for inviting me to this very interesting panel. So just to pick up on what you were mentioning earlier about the very basics of this discussion. So what was the purpose, what were the goals, the objectives on the TTC, and how expectations from different stakeholders were matched or not. And also to pick up on a question that I received just earlier, exactly as AmCham EU, were you disappointed by this exercise? So to be honest, talking about disappointment would be very unfair at this point in time, because if we really have to be honest, despite all expectations and build up on the CTC, the very basic lines, the very basic objectives were met. So from a basic standpoint, let's say, it was definitely a success in the sense of, as already mentioned, rebuilding trust, recovering basically from a very traumatic experience that was the first presidency of Donald Trump, really building up this dialogue infrastructure, especially at working level, so a much more acceptive, smooth and open kind of communication and engagement on trying to understand each other. What was also, I think, very appreciated and successful to a certain extent from our standpoint was the kind of stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders, and especially the business community, was really put forward as one of the main actors, the main participants to this dialogue. And again, it was a dialogue, or at least perceived as such, also from our perspective. Could have been done better? Yes, absolutely, and happy to dive a little more into the details of that, but definitely a success on the point. What happens then, where we can potentially start talking about a little disappointment, is it's true there was a mismatch of expectations and mismatch in our understanding of the goals and the objectives between like the EU and the US, as already outlined, but also from the business perspective. Obviously, when you hear and when you read in the first statement of the TTC that one of the objectives is promoting, increasing bilateral trade and investment, you get excited as a business community. You start thinking, okay, there are the basics here to finally create a proper integrated transatlantic marketplace to really improve the business environment, to reduce costs to do business, increase investment, and so on and so forth. Did we get that out of this? Probably could have been much better, let's put it this way. So there was definitely on our side, again, exactly a little of mismatch of expectations, misunderstanding probably. It's potentially also our fault in what our expectations were, despite not obviously expecting a free trade agreement, but at least much more work also on the trade side. I cover trade for AmCham EU, and it's exactly like, felt a little neglected in all this discussion. My colleagues working on digital policy were really super, super busy. On my side, it was a little, maybe this very last TTC, I started to see a little of action with the Sustainable Trade Initiative. But it's true there was a little like lack of the trade facilitation, the investment bit that we were hoping for. And then at the end of the day, also maybe just last word on this mismatch again that we saw. It's true that under the TTC, there were good dialogue, there was trust that was rebuilt, so extremely positive in that sense, providing stability also on from our standpoint to this transatlantic relationship. But when you dive into the details of other discussions between the EU and US outside of the TTC, I'm still unsure we can really talk about this trust that was rebuilt. Except it was mentioned, discussions like on trade irritants like the steel and aluminium, the critical minerals as well, IRA. The level of trust there, it's definitely not where it was expected to be and what we expected the TTC would bring in the end of the day. So we start seeing exactly like a double let's say, direction in this transatlantic relationship. One, which is going great on the surface with the TTC, but when you really get into the nitty-gritty of it, we're still really far from rebuilding this in terms that are actually then bringing us forward and bringing like the benefits that we need to have.
Thanks for that perspective. One of the things I think that's fascinating about the TTC is when it was introduced and announced, it was very clear what it was not. And my recollection was that it was not about retroactive issues. It wasn't like trade in goods. It was meant to be much more forward-looking. And then it does seem like a lot of things were carved out of it. And to one of the points earlier about in the report about the expectations for China, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there a separate US-EU group looking at China relations? So yeah, we could maybe touch on that. But they're just, I think, I'm interested to hear the panel's thoughts on this. But, the TTC, yes, it has its focus, but there are so many other groups and working parties on other issues, like steel and aluminum, not in TTC, but it all affects each other. So maybe that's a place to start. Coming back to Dimitar and Bill, one, what you've heard here, how does that fit in with what you heard in preparing the report, but also this issue of the TTC is just one among many efforts, and how does it either sort of rise above or fit in with them?
Thanks for the question, Dan, and maybe to pick it up and to elevate it on a more macro perspective, it's an interesting question. Are we moving in a time of post-free trade agreements, and we couldn't set up TTIP? Fine. So what new territory are we actually navigating in? Because it's obvious, and people always say about the Americans here that there's fatigue when it comes to FTAs. There's also a fatigue on the European side when it comes to free trade agreements. We have many free trade agreements internationally. In the EU, we are one of the champions of FTAs. But look what's happened with the Mercosur agreement, for example, 20 years of negotiations. Now you're in the final line, and now it's stalled because of political reasons. And there's another interesting aspect here. Because we've had globalization and so much advancement and different rounds of GATT and the World Trade Organization, we've had so many progress when it comes to mitigating tariffs and getting the economy flowing, that many administrations now see very little wins when it comes to FTAs. So maybe TTC is this new chapter of a la carte, open, take your pick type of FTA, where you cannot agree on everything. You cannot agree on the marinated chicken, was it, in TTIP? And chlorinated chicken, and the butter and the investment arbitrage mechanisms and all that kind of destroyed the huge negotiations we had with the Obama administration. But now we're actually making progress into areas which actually give us a lot of bang for our buck. Technology, specific kind of trade, and I'm really happy that now we're talking about sustainable trade and also about economic security. And to close on your question, yes, all of these things touch upon each other, but I think now we're trying to streamline our work between the two administrations and make sure that we carve more flexible, more nimble types of tools and mechanisms that we push forward on these major issues.
Yeah. No, Dan, I think we're moving into an era where free trade is almost taboo, or at least fading from a realistic goal. And I think what we're seeing in what we hope from the Trade and Technology Council is it can manage sort of the protectionist industrial policy agendas. I've seen some success, whether it's happened inside the TTC or around the TTC. Would be on, for example, coordinating on the CHIPS Act, supporting semiconductors. I think there's been relative progress. Defusing the IRA, yes, a lot of that happened outside. We recount how it was President Macron and President Biden who struck the deal 2 days before in the White House, and they had a fancy state dinner with a fantastic 6-course meal, and then TTC was out in the suburbs at the University of Maryland with, I think, a buffet lunch or whatever. But but we did want to get that type of granular detail to make the report come alive. But I do think it is managing this new era. And yeah, there are other things around. What we would like to see the TTCs take a leading role in coordinating that type of work. We've talked a lot about the dangers of the challenges of the American election, but I think there are some challenges too from the American perspective for the European elections. If we do see a swing right in Europe, will it be an Orban type of swing right, open to China's investment from ByteDance and others, or from the Chinese electric vehicles, open to Russia? Or will we see sort of the Maloney line, which is actually more pro-digital than we could have expected, and a little more international pulling out of Belt and Road? So, I think there are risks on both sides of the Atlantic that could torpedo this process. And a lot of our proposals are to try to make that more difficult to blow it up. Just to answer, we're not proposing to get rid of the working groups. I think they're a good discussion tool, but if that becomes the main part of the TTC, then we get lost in the forest. And so we wanted some more political leadership, and I think you were making a start in trying to focus the work on very specific big issues.
Just picking up on a couple of points. Yes, on free trade agreements, which is actually the end of traditional free trade agreements, something I and others have written about. And let's also remember the final death of TTIP happened under Trump, but really it had died in Europe before that. Germany and Britain killed it, among others. There was another point I wanted to pick up on. It escapes me at the moment, but we'll come back to it. But I'd love to shift. Oh, I remember what it was. Sorry. I wanted to say that in free trade, AmCham EU puts out a great report every year on the transatlantic economy, which, if anybody's interested in this, I highly recommend it. And one of the authors, Dan Hamilton, made a great point that the US and EU essentially have free trade on most things, that tariffs are so low. Yeah. And the other thing is that, yes, there's a huge volume of trade in goods, but the real economic connection between the US and EU is foreign direct investment, that each side is producing and delivering much more through plants and facilities in the other one's economy. So in some ways, yes, it's taboo, but we've also, in especially the big advanced economies, moved beyond some of these things. But I wanted to pick up, if we could, we've talked a bit about the CHIPS Act, and we've talked a lot about things that aren't going right. But Mikkel, you mentioned this, but my sense is that chips are an area where cooperation, maybe if it isn't great, at least seems to be going okay. So maybe if we can, this goes against my instinct as a reporter, but to focus on something positive, and maybe talk about what's going on there. So maybe Alina, could you talk a little bit about
I can
cooperate
talk
on
a
chips?
little bit, but I'm not covering the tech side here,
Okay.
so I'm really focusing on trade side. But as far as I know, on chips, indeed, we have coordinated our approach to subsidies when it comes to subsidies, and we are working on the issues around essential chips, essential semiconductors, which means legacy chips, and there we had a very useful stakeholder event in Washington where these issues were discussed, and we kind of discovered that that's very, very important on all of those issues which are very sensitive to involve directly businesses concerned, and to get the first information from them to ensure that we are kind of when we take an action, that it doesn't harm our each other interests. So there is work ongoing, and we are preparing quite a lot for the next TTC meeting.
Okay. Mikkel, from the industry perspective, you talk about stakeholder engagement. So the stakeholder view.
Well, I mean, the stakeholder engagement, again, as I mentioned, it was great to be part of the discussion. I think, as Elina mentioned, it was really like a lot of experimentation with different formats all across like the different TTC meetings. So there's definitely like formats that worked better and formats that didn't work. I think one to really point out is the format that was used, for instance, at the TIST event. So it was a much more focused discussion, much more concrete. We received questions in advance. It was pretty well organized. And again, we managed to get into the details of that. So if I have to give a feedback, and especially if I have to point out to a format that we definitely would like to see repurposed also for other discussions under TTC outside of TIST, it's definitely this one. Coupled, obviously, also with more higher level discussion, for instance, exactly we overheard, like this discussion with CEOs, so like leaders, global business leaders on semiconductors. So it's a mix of these that definitely is useful. At the same time, I think sometimes what it felt as a stakeholder representative, it was more of like a tick box exercise, especially at the very beginning, and especially again on the US side. We're Amchamir, we're based in Europe, so we interact obviously with the Commission and the TTD. I personally don't really know what's happening on the US side. There's no coordination that much as far as we see it with their stakeholder engagement. You have like two different, again, planned like levels of discussion, two different levels of engagement. You have exactly a European Commission that is really proactive, that is really getting there, organizing these events. I mean, this is what we heard also as a feedback from the US Chamber. The TIS event was organized completely by DG Trade. And kudos to you, because recently their counterpart was completely absent. So, and again, we see value in that. What can be done better, apart from exactly this kind of like format and repurposing this format, is also like a better preparation. Like we receive notice of these events, of these stakeholder consultations, meetings, civil society dialogues too last minute. Especially as a trade association, we need time to go to our stakeholders, to our companies, to gather input that can be valuable. I mean, we want to play our part. We want to give valuable input. We want to give concrete, specific input and help to advance the conversation. But we need the tools, we need the time, we need the predictability for it. And especially, we need to be sure that this is then taken on board. To the TIST example, we had these discussions. We have no idea where this input is going, how it's going to be taken on board, who listened to it. So there's also like a complete lack of clarity of like, is our input really taken on board and how? And so probably, yes, streamlining stakeholder engagement is definitely one of the main deliverables that we are expecting for TTC6, and which again also will ensure the continuation of the TTC. If you don't have stakeholders engaged, a business community engaged on this topic, you will hardly have the TTC continue after elections on both sides of the Atlantic.
Okay. Before I go back to the authors, Elina, did you want to say anything in react to that?
Stakeholder engagement, I think we have tried to accommodate as much as we could the input from the stakeholder community. We have a broad stakeholder community, and we are receiving a lot of contribution from it, and I think we really appreciate that. I think what has to be understood is that sometimes when it comes to trade facilitation, market access issues, it's very difficult now in the current political context to somehow promote these ideas in the US. So we are kind of restricted in that area to move forward on some of the issues. Where we see that the stakeholders, they show their disappointment afterwards. So that's one of the issues. On the format, I would say, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, this is a platform which is evolving, and we are trying to find the best ways on how to work and how to get the deliverables. So the TIST event, I would say, is a role model for the moment. And exactly also the discussion with the semiconductor companies, which brought very, very useful input to the co-chairs. So I think we are going to look at exactly this model, and we are thinking of maybe opening up the working groups for stakeholder engagement. So there are different ideas which are now being floating around and which we try to put together now in an ideas paper for the next and final TTC meeting.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it is interesting that the semiconductor was more successful as a stakeholder engagement because it was focused and it was concrete. And I think the AI in the UK was successful because it was focused and maybe less concrete, but focused and served as a sort of forum. I'm coming more from the digital side of this, and one of the surprising things we write about is the TTC sort of neglected digital regulation. Europe has gone ahead with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Americans basically didn't engage on that or didn't use this as a forum. We felt that that was a sort of missed opportunity, not necessarily because the Americans opposed what the Europeans were doing, but because it created a sort of sense that Europe was charging ahead unilaterally and not engaging with America about its really, I mean, revolutionary digital regulation. So we may be going backwards on trade or at least treading water, but we're moving at F1 speed on digital regulation, and the TTC ignored that. We thought that was an error and needs to be corrected too.
Okay. Dimitar, you made a comment before. I want to shift to the world of things green. Because it affects both the environment and the economy, because it's such a huge growing area. Your comment that the U.S. seems to be warming to CBAM. I mean, if that were the case, that would be huge, because this is a mammoth potential problem, especially if the next administration is a Trump administration. So I'm interested in what you're hearing, and then maybe Michael, if I can come to you for the business perspective on this. But, I mean, jumping off from there, but more broadly, and this idea of Lena, you talked about the green tech area. What is the potential here? What are the potential pitfalls? Curious where the panel sees this going.
I may be pushing my luck here. As I mentioned in the opening, it is a think tank pitch, of course, and I'm absolutely aware of the political realities specifically about 2024. By the way, we had a really good Martens Center research paper. The author is in the audience about CBAM in general. It's a very comprehensive, in-depth study on the problems internationally, WTO, also international partners and so forth. But CBAM is a fact. Right now, there's a preparatory phase, and from 26, it's actually gonna start biting, so to say. Now, the US hasn't officially warmed up officially to something like this, but I see certain signals, and the signals are the following. There is advancement in bilateral, I mean, between the EU and the US, talks about how do we actually calculate carbon footprints. And there is a willingness, I think there's even a new act in Congress which is tabled specifically about America doing its homework and pushing forward on exactly these technical aspects of having a clear view what exact footprint the industry produces and how do we calculate these emissions. Europe is really ahead. So we've had the emissions trading system since the early 2000s. We had all of these regulations and progress in the last 20 years, and there is a realization in the US that, okay, our national security and economic interests in the last 20 years were based on the fact that we will produce a lot, and the US pivoted from dirty coal because of the shale revolution in the 2000s. The US made good progress on wind technology as well, and energy efficiency. But ultimately, the US is also one of the global polluters, 14%, 12% of the global carbon total. So right now, if we are serious about pressuring the Chinese and the Mexicans and the Indonesians, maybe also the Russians, who knows. On climate, we need to have some kind of tools which are also offensive in a way, which force these countries to either have the corresponding carbon tax regime within their borders or just pay an extra tariff. And the only way to be serious about global taxation of dirty carbon until the end of this decade is if the two economic blocs, the US and Europe, are serious about working on this together. Not gonna happen in 24, maybe not gonna happen by the midterms, but I hope that this was actually going to transpire. And finally, on the pitfalls or on the problems, of course it's politics in the States. For this kind of advancement, you need bipartisan support, coming back to the agreement on critical materials with the EU. Right now, the US is a bit reluctant. You would need congressional support for having such an agreement with the Europeans. But here I'm asking, wait a tick, last year you concluded such an agreement with the Japanese. So the US has a critical material agreement with the Japanese about security of supply and potentially about tax breaks as well. So why give the Japanese preferential treatment, obviously, and why not give it to the Europeans?
Nicole, the view from industry side?
Yeah, I mean, I won't focus that much on CBAM and our position on that, but yeah, I mean, to your point, we were in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, I'm not sure they're warming up to the idea at all. But it's true that there is awareness on the need to like really address this issue from like its fundamentals, exactly like the calculation of emissions is definitely something that there is general awareness that they're lagging behind and they need to catch up, and it's blocking some of like the main like negotiations that we're having, the GSA, as you mentioned, critical minerals and so on. So there is awareness on that. But just to your point on this green tech, let's say, space, green marketplace, well, this is definitely some of like the major things that we are pushing for. And to this point as well, like the teeth again proved going towards like towards the right direction. So, and also it was perceived on our side a little as, okay, we learned something from the drama of the IRA, that basically taking two unilateral approaches and different approaching on something that actually is a common goal, a common objective, a common interest, but without trying to explore synergies, explore complementarity, exactly in a strategic way. So exactly without having a strategic coordinated approach doesn't work. So the IRA is there now. It's a matter of fact, you can't do anything about it. What can you do is exactly now to try to address this lack of synergies through this coordinated approach to the TIS. So the TIS for us is definitely a very welcome exercise that is bringing us towards this creation of a transatlantic marketplace. The problem, once again, comes back to ambition, level of ambition, and what is the EU expecting out of that, and what the US is expecting out of us, of that. The EU, and especially, I mean, us also as business community, we do want like a marketplace in the real sense, which means, again, trade facilitation in the end of the day. That means alignment on standards, harmonization, reduction of costs. As I said, I'm not sure the US is understanding this. Like if you see, for instance, how difficult the discussion just on a mutual recognition agreement on conformity assessment for green goods is. Again, the EU is putting this forward, pushing a lot for this. The US is not having it. So there is, again, unfortunately, a mismatch there that is blocking us from a very gold opportunity to, again, leverage, as was mentioned, leverage this market, leverage this trade that is already existing to become a powerhouse, basically, together, leverage what I like to call the transatlantic effect, which is there, which is real, and needs now to be scaled up, and also with others. That's my last point, probably. We're doing that much now, except on sustainable trade, a lot of discussion on carbon emissions cutting and so on and so forth. That needs to be done with others. Again, we are trying to address a common issue, a common challenge. This needs to be scaled up with others, in other fora, with like-minded countries, trying to, again, be strategic about this, also with other countries, so not try to repeat, let's say, the same mistake that was done in a multilateral way, but with our like little club of US together. We need to include other countries in the discussion and leverage this at the end of the day together.
Okay. I'm going to open up to questions in 1 second, but you mentioned conformity assessments and green goods, and you, if I caught it correctly, sort of hinted that that's an area where there could be deliverables in April, or at least progress. And my understanding is that even within TTIP, conformity assessments was an area where a lot of progress was made. And then finally, it's interesting that looking at the trade in green goods and services, a huge number of the companies in the US developing the new green economy are European companies. I mean, Repsol, Siemens Gamesa are enormous there, at least as big, Vestas. You tantalized us, Alina, with comments about April and what we might expect, but is there anything more you can say, especially in the what I jotted down was sustainable trade and conformity assessments?
Yeah, well, if I may quickly on this, we are well. Thanks for expressing your support for this, but we keep pushing the US on since they've been more reluctant to engage on conformity assessment. This is why we think that we need to narrow down it to green tech, specific green tech areas where we can do it.
Okay. I guess we will all stay tuned. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Tommy, you had a question, and then after the gentleman in the blue tie.
Sorry, so I guess in the beginning I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Tommy Huhtanen, Executive Director of the Martens Center. So excellent panel, really interesting discussion. Just very short question. Dimitar explained in the beginning the different expectation, and I think the discussion has been now very fruitful on EU-US. But how about this US expectation to China? How is that going now? Because that we haven't touched so much. How this concept, have been used to tackle that challenge, the issue of China? So, up to moderator to decide who to give.
No, and maybe how much is done in TTC and how much is done in this other forum, or I understand a lot is done through Treasury and financial side of things. So,
well, I mean, it was a little bit outside the scope of what we were looking at in this report. Actually, one of our next projects is on can there be a united decoupling definition on decoupling? I see that Europe and the US has moved somewhat together. We're moving away in the US, away from de-risking, agreeing with decoupling, but we have to define it. And we are working with Dan Hamilton, who you mentioned, to try to get that type of professor at Johns Hopkins who puts out the Transatlantic report to get some concrete answers of what we would mean by decoupling, because there's still challenges ahead, as you know, both internally in Europe and in the US. How do you continue to sell chips to China while restricting advanced technology? We're in sort of new territory now, really. So, but it was a little bit outside the scope, and it didn't surprise me that I never saw, to be frank, Dimitar, we downplayed that. I never saw the TTC as a sort of vehicle for coordinating just on China. It started out more about Russia, I would say. Hopefully the discussions led to this, but it got bogged down in actually the details rather than the general stance or putting meat on the stance towards China. Maybe a goal for the next administration.
One does get the sense that in Washington these days everything is about China or maybe about the border. And so, yeah. We had a question here from the gentleman on the end.
Thank you very much, Jarosław Pietras. I'm a senior associate researcher in Martens Center, but also visiting professor in Bruges College of Europe. And I have took part in 2 stakeholders meetings. As academician, someone not as a stakeholder having an interest, but the interest of intellectual nature in these meetings. So I was to Lula and to Washington. And I could say that I couldn't see the bigger difference between 2 meetings. The one was devoted to artificial intelligence in a large sense, and was attended by high-level officials, including Blinken, including Tai, including Raimondo. On the American side, also on European side, Dombrovskis, Vestager, and so And the discussion was very serious because this was a serious issue which is regulated on both sides of the Atlantic in a certain way. It's a different way, and I think it was very useful to have this type of discussion. In Washington, it was no high-level presence except for video message, because probably it was too far to the hotel in Washington from the offices of either trade representative or Department of Commerce. So there was much more of the stakeholders engagement. And my question here is whether without big business interested in this type of exercise, you could have a really fruitful outcome. What I have seen, and you, Daniel, have said it, there are many companies that were present, which are European companies operating in the US, and some European stakeholders. So you had the feeling that you don't have a genuine motor, genuine power behind this discussion. And the issue of agreement, trade agreement between EU and US was mentioned by these stakeholders. They were saying very frequently, unfortunately, we do not have a trade agreement because it gives a framework, it gives a fundament for many other discussions. If we would have an agreement, then there would be much less problem with many things. And then we could come into very detailed issues, like, for example, using PFAS, which is forbidden in Europe, or which is being attempted to be forbidden in Europe, banned in Europe, whereas it's used in a number of applications in the green economy in the US. So you've got a very detailed issues which cannot be solved separately from a general framework. And my worry to a certain extent was that while in the LULEA there was a really big high-level involvement of political layers, in Washington it was much more of the business, but not the generally business, EU and US business, but it was this business that was interested in sustainable trade. And the final comment, I think it's, because it could sound a bit pessimistic, but I think it is not, because narrative is an important issue. I mean, to have a narrative, to have a discussion, to have a ephemeric maybe, but atmospheric discussion which gives to business some certainty in facing, when they are facing lack of legal frames. And for example, if you look about critical materials that Dimitar was referring to, you know, in the beginning of 2000, there has been some major intellectual saying there cannot be a war between countries that have a McDonald's or they use a Dell computer. Because if they use commonly Dell computer, they've got a common interest and they cannot have a war between them, which has appeared is not true. However, for critical materials, for example, we have been telling to companies there is no risk to go globally because there will be no war because of that. So if you say there is a risk in critical materials, it's already something symptomatic and something which gives a guidance to the companies that they start to calculate risk. So I think it is something which is very important. And maybe last comment on CBAM, because that's what I was referring to. I think in the US there has been an attempt much earlier than Europe to put a carbon price on frontier. And there was in Congress, there has been a legislation which unfortunately was not passed. Oh, maybe fortunately, but was not passed. I was talking to James Bacchus, who was the last US appellate body president. And he said, you don't imagine that Congress is able to invent CBAM or something like this, carbon price on borders, without having carbon price inside. So maybe Dimitar has got some better feeling of what might happen.
Anybody want to pick up on? Any element of that, sure.
Yeah, maybe one point that you mentioned that I found interesting is you said you can't solve some issues separately. And that's a very interesting point, because it's one of the major points of discussion right now in AmCham when thinking about the future of TTC, like should we review the scope of it? Again, like the amount of issues that we talk about, and exactly to the point also at the beginning, like this platform was meant to discuss forward-looking issues, upcoming challenges, right? Non-frictional, let's say, points. My question at this point in time, analyzing all this, is how far we can go, how sustainable it is to keep talking about those non-frictional points without actually trying to solve those basic philosophical differences that we have, like very basic differences in approaches. Exactly. I mean, I see that we can avoid some of the difference, or like get into, again, the meat of the issue and agree on like top level principles, guidelines, but then for me it comes with a trade-off. And again, as a business perspective, you want to see something that is concrete, you want deliverables that are concrete and then bring an impact. So if you keep focusing on those top-level, superficial, non-controversial issues, you will never be able to actually deliver something that is impactful in the end of the day, because you will not solve the basic issues. And again, we see it right now exactly with the GSA, with the critical raw materials. Like, those are the things that actually have an impact, and on those things we are not discussing, because there's exactly these philosophical differences we want to avoid under TTC, and we're blocked. So, I mean, I see the sense, and it's difficult to pick a side between the minimalists and the maximalists, as you were mentioning, but it's also true that we need to start thinking about how sustainable this is going to be. If you want the TTC to survive, probably we have also to accept the fact that at a certain point we will have to sit down and talk about the differences as well.
Dimitar, I want to add, but before we come to you, I just want to say, it strikes me you've hit on the essence there of the conundrum that probably got us to TTIP in the first place. Each side wanted more and more things in the talks, and suddenly you had these sprawling talks that ultimately proved maybe too big. But I think your comment and what you just raised, I want to come back to maybe as sort of a closing thought after Dimitar. But what is the future? And can TTC continue to exist if there were to be a Trump 2 administration? But Dimitar, you had something on your mind.
Just a very brief remark on the critical materials and the whole exchange and the agreements, to make it a bit more specific, because we're talking about these, abbreviations or wishy-washy terms, to make it very specific. It's not only about the fact that European companies want to have access to the IRA or IRA subsidies. There's Irish people in the crowd, so the acronym should be maybe IRA. It's not only about the subsidies. It's not only about getting the tax credits. The Chinese already gave us a warning shot. They signaled some restrictions on their export of germanium and gallium, specific minerals. This is not the end of the world. You can find supply from elsewhere, but the Chinese are reminding us that they are, if not producing, but for sure processing 90% of these minerals internationally. It's very difficult to pivot away from them when it comes to price, when it comes to mass production and all of that. So I think this is why we need to get serious about this type of critical mineral agreement, because of security of supply and tackling the Chinese challenge together. And I'm really happy that the European Commission is talking about economic security more seriously now. Because let's face it, the Chinese have leverage. The Chinese are subsidizing their industries. They're using dirty stuff. They're using slave labor, the full shebang, so that they can keep their economic advantages. So we need to wake up to this fact.
Yeah, the Chinese even pick minerals named after France and Germany to drive home their message.
Make it even more personal.
Gentleman in the front row.
Allow me to ask a provocative question.
If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Andras Laszlo. I'm from a Hungarian consultancy company. In Hungarian, they say that the dog barks and the money speaks. Is the problem of mistrust and trust and lack of collaboration not the source of it, not the still dominating and almost highly mantra, money, 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 and the winner takes it all. ABBA sung it. And isn't it hardly time to move on and finally have a tipping point to another mantra, the win, 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 and really walk the talk?
Okay, I guess the question is there a way to achieve that that's not focused just on money? And so, is there another way to measure winning in the global economy?
Well, I'll pick up a little bit from what Dimitar was saying. I think one way that we didn't explore as much as maybe we should have in the report is whether, dealing with China and finding a common consensus. I can see Trump buying into anti-China actions and so forth might be a way of really a smart way of addressing the challenges, the turbulence that we can expect in the coming year. So thank you for pushing us on that. If we write a new report, we'll have to emphasize that as an opportunity, and perhaps it'll also be a chance that, sorry from Hungary, that pushing back against Viktor Orban and his, flouting of European solidarity both to Russia and China.
Maybe if I can come back to this final question and lead into it by, I think, observing that while people remember the unpredictability, some say chaos, some say psychodrama of the Trump administration, Bob Lighthizer and other members of the trade team did strike a few trade deals. It's not like under Trump, trade stopped and trade negotiations stopped. So I'm interested in what the panel thinks about the future, maybe both, if it were a second Biden administration or a Trump administration. Maybe you were just in Washington?
Yes. We just came back from Washington, D.C. with a delegation of members, and obviously elections on the U.S. side were on top of the agenda. I mean, especially, again, taking it from a trade specifically perspective, the expectation there is nothing is going to change, in the sense that no matter if it's a Biden 2 or Trump 2, because at this point in time it's sure it's going to be one or the other, when it comes to trade policy and that kind of discussion and engagement, it's still not going to be great. It's not going to be solved. They're not going to be back in the game. The US will still disengage and take a more protectionist, isolationist approach, no matter what the presidency will be, which again means from a business perspective, we need to be prepared. So we're preparing for both scenarios. Needless to say that if Trump is the winner, we are going to have to buckle up a little more. So the kind of contingency plans that we need to put in place are definitely different. We do expect much more protections, obviously, coming out for that. But again, when it comes really to the overall sentiment, is that there's not going to be a major improvement from specifically, again, this trade engagement of the US at international stage. I mean, there's MC13 at WTO in, few weeks. Same, we don't expect anything major coming out of these elections from this standpoint. When it comes again to the topic of the discussion, TTC, well, obviously the discussion is much different. From our perspective, is that no matter the administration, this exercise will manage to survive, or at least this is obviously our hope and our main call, because of the working level discussion and dialogue is there, is strong, and it's healthy. So despite the changes in the administration and also the changes of the principles that are involved at political level in the TTC, we expect that to continue. But then exactly the question is the political level. Will it manage to survive at political level? Again, because also the principles are going to change. This is also an important thing to keep in mind. Vestager is not going to be there, Dombrovskis, who knows, Tai, Raimondo, all these people will probably be gone. So how can we ensure to keep the political momentum there? Our responsibility as business, mentioning the narrative, exactly, is to keep the narrative alive, to keep the narrative positive, and to keep supporting this exercise, and now hoping for the better.
Elina, if I can ask, I spent a lot of time at NATO, where these days everyone's talking about Trump-proofing NATO. Is the Commission busy Trump-proofing TTC? Is it possible?
Trump-proofing, yeah. Well, we have had already Trump first. So
But
exactly
the
as you
TTC
said.
existed.
But no, we are, as the European Commission, we are not commenting on elections in certain countries. What I can say is that if it's going to be the Biden administration continuing in this role, then we may expect more or less the same dynamics in our trade relationship. Maybe we may expect a bit more opening on the steel and aluminium talks, where we have received some commitment to move forward until the next deadline in our suspension plan, tariff suspension plan. So we may have some more progress there. I hope we will get the critical minerals agreement delivered still within this mandate, this political cycle. So, and as for the Trump, I think trade policy features quite strongly in his political rhetoric. So I guess this is what it is.
Okay. I guess we'll close by coming back to the report's authors for final thoughts, observations, looks forward.
I guess I'll use my final thoughts to encourage one issue that we haven't discussed, which is data flows and the commitment to free and open internet, which the United States, ironically, is pushing back on. Came a little late for the actual report. Europe is going ahead also with a cloud certification program that is blatantly, I would say, protectionist, potentially. Blatantly protectionist. It isn't decided yet. So I would think Trade and Technology Council in the coming year at least should be able to stand by that we want an internet that isn't Russian, Chinese, Arab dominated, state controlled, and that we should try to use the TTC to get that type of ringing declaration. And it means the Americans have to move away from what they've been doing in the last couple months too.
And give us better safeguards on secure data as well. Not only free and open data, but also security and provisions against unlawful surveillance by specific agencies. But I don't want to, get into that specifically for the closing remarks. On a more optimistic note on the future of TTC, if it's a Democrat administration, we're seeing capitalize on the wins. Maybe I gave a bit of a pessimistic, angle in some of the questions, but the TTC has had major achievements. As Bill mentioned, it did survive the test of time, specifically when we had the invasion in Russia, the export controls alignment on Russia and Belarus. These were great achievements by a format which maybe wasn't even, engendered for such important talks. So keep up the work with this administration. Make sure to capitalize in the future on a potential Trump administration. Well, what can I say? We already had the first mandate. It's a bit weird that both the Democrat opposition in the States and also a big part of Brussels is behaving as if it's 2016 again. Oh my God, is it gonna happen? Well, it happened once. Let's not hope that Trump is just canceled out by a court order so that the Democrats get a, automatic win. No, let's prepare for this. And to reference here the great work by Valdis Dombrovskis' team, specifically on the anti-coercion instrument, so that Europe has a federal, even though still up-and-coming mechanism that can respond to third country pressures on the trade front coming from the Chinese and, God forbid, coming from the Americans. So here I close.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank our hosts for having me. It's been a great opportunity. And I'd like to thank all the panelists. Mikol, Elena, thank you for your input. And I'd like to congratulate the report's authors on a great, I have to say one of the nice things about it is it's not too long. I was reading over it last night and got through it, and it's really well packaged. So congratulations. Must be your, yes, Bill, your history in journalism. Yes. Bill and I used to work together. So
at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I think we're all invited to stay for lunch and talk more about these ideas and issues. So thank you all. Thanks, everybody.